Hey, good morning, sixth graders. So I'm going to go through a real quick science lesson with you. I've got a series of stuff that I want you to look at this week and next week. And we're going to start with growth and development in plants and animals. And well, let's just get into it. So here are your objectives. I know I have it when I can identify the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, and I can explain how genetic information is passed from one generation to the next. Those are going to be your main objectives here. Okay, so asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. Let's take a look first at asexual reproduction. This is, and we've talked about this in class with when we were talking about cells and bacterium and how these cells can just kind of, let me see if I can draw this out. They can start as one cell, right? And then they start to like split their DNA into halves, and then it just kind of splits here, and then they end up in two separate um, I like things, not people. They end up in two different things, two different cells with exactly identical genetic information. And so let's take a look. Let me get rid of that real quick. So let's take a look at asexual versus sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is the process by which a single organism produces genetically identical offspring. These are completely identical. Nothing has changed. This type of reproduction is most common in single-celled organisms like bacteria, but it can also be found in complex organisms as well. And we're going to learn that as we get into plant reproduction, because there are some plants that asexually reproduce. And so this is kind of what I was talking about with, it starts with one, it's got that little nucleus in there. All of the DNA kind of starts to separate out, and then it just splits. And this is called binary fission. And so asexual reproduction is a reproductive process devoid of gamete formation. And we're going to talk about gametes in a second. So let's talk about sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction requires two organisms, right? So it requires a male and a female, and each organism has specialized cells or sex cells called gametes. So animals have sperm and ovum, male and female, and plants have pollen, which acts as sperm, and ovum and eggs. So, and a lot of times plants, the ovum is fruit. So it's usually what we eat, right? Sexual reproduction happens when the two sex cells fuse together to create new and genetically different offspring. And this is a huge sticking point. These are fusing together to create new and genetically different offspring. So like this. So this would be asexual reproduction, where I'm taking one and I'm making an exact replica copy of another. This is more sexual selection, where I have male, female, blue, orange, and I'm taking half of their chromosomes and I'm putting them together to make a brand new one. Take half of these, make this new one. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits biologically of asexual reproduction in organisms. So these are rapid growth populations because they don't need others to reproduce themselves. So bacteria, when they're inside of you, they don't need another bacteria to say, I'm going to reproduce. They just do it. They don't need anyone else's stuff. This requires a lot more energy to reproduce, or less energy to reproduce. They don't have as many steps. It's just, and usually with binary fission, it's just they split the sides and they cut it in half. Not a big deal. So all of these organisms are capable of reproduction, not just the females of the species. They're all able to do it. And that's a huge benefit for these organisms that keep them alive, right? And so one organism can make a whole population. So it only takes one. And, you know, like if This is highly, highly unlikely to happen in your body because you have an immune system, but if only one gets inside of you, it has a potential to producing an entire colony or an entire population. So yeah. So these organisms are obviously less likely to become extinct because they could just reproduce on their own. And each offspring is a genetic copy of a parent, right? It's like an exact replica. And so I put a couple of pictures up here for you. So we can see, so this is our cell. It splits the DNA, these little red spots. Then it just has two daughter cells, what we would call it. Plants, same thing. They can fertilize each other and create brand new ones. Here's the fruit. Here's where the pollen or the sperm would be stored, right? Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of sexual reproduction. And the biggest part is that it allows for more genetic diversity. So for example, in here, these birds, I put these birds, these are the Galapagos finches. And what Darwin found in his studies when he was looking at these birds and he was noticing that some of these birds were more they were more successful in other ways than that. Like these birds, they were really good with these huge gigantic beaks at snapping seeds. They could pop open seeds and get to the inside of that seed, no big deal. These birds really struggled with that. However, these birds were really, really good at getting to the inside of flowers in the nectar, and they could suck up that nectar and be nourished from that. Whereas these birds, their beaks don't fit in those flowers, right? And then he also noticed that some of these birds had medium-sized beaks. It didn't fit into a flower, and it wasn't big enough to crush a nut. So what do you think happened to these populations? Yeah, they became extinct real quick. They did not stand a chance. These guys were successful and these guys were successful. But these ones, they went extinct, and we call that survival of the fittest in natural selection, which we'll talk about, we'll get there. But right now, what I need you to know is that sexual reproduction takes mom genes and dad genes and makes a brand new organism. It's not an exact replica, and they found that it was really advantageous for big beak birds and small beak birds. But if big and small mixed, they did not have successful offspring. Okay, so let's get back over here to the advantages. There's more adaptability, more variation, and we talked about that. There's a greater chance for mutation, and we're going to talk about mutation a little bit more, but all you need to know, and I'll write it down here, what you need to know is that mutation is at any change, so let's write change. Ooh, this is hard to do with a mouse. Change to the DNA. Okay. So a greater chance of survivability when faced with environmental changes, and that's because of how much more complex they are, honestly. Okay. Here's another example of genetic diversity in flowers. This is the same species with different flower colorations. They're going to attract different kinds of bugs, right? Bees being a main pollinator, they might go to the yellow ones, right? Also, they have some of these, if you look, these signs, they kind of, I guess they signal for other different kinds of organisms to come in. And I'm really not a plant expert, but it's very advantageous to have different coloration and kind of stuff for other organisms to also be pollinating. Okay, so if we look at this and we just look at the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. So number of parents, one parent for asexual, two parents for sexual reproduction. What do offspring look like? In asexual reproduction, it's exactly identical. There are no other variations of this. So if I am a corn plant and I self-reproduce, I can make new corn, but it will look exactly how because that's all of the material that's coming from, right? Whereas if I have two parents, I have half coming from dad and half coming from mom, and I can make a brand new organism in the same species, right? And that's why we look similar to our parents, but not exactly alike. And so if we look at the DNA, this is exactly the same, whereas this is combined from two different parts, right? Okay. Another visual representation of asexual reproduction, it just goes from DNA to DNA. Well, in sexual reproduction, I have the DNA of the sperm, I have the DNA of the egg, and it creates a zygote of both egg and sperm. And zygote just means like tiny, tiny baby inside the womb. Again, this is just showing genetic variation or genetic diversity. This is not diverse at all. This just goes from plain boring DNA to plain boring DNA. Whereas when I have mom and dad together, I have all sorts of different kinds of recombination probabilities. I can do any of these. I might look like any of these, right? I might have be tall, short. I might be medium size, small, medium size. These are all different genetic variations of that same DNA. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. I wanted to talk to you real quick about next lessons coming up. We need to look at animal characteristics and behaviors. So now that we understand the genetic material is passed either from the same organism or it gets it from another organism, and those genetics. So those genetic characteristics actually are a huge part of how organisms interact with each other and make themselves successful in their own organismal life. And then we'll go into plant reproduction. And then we'll start to talk about genetic factors and the effects of growth and development. And then we can get really hot and heavy with genetics on a molecular level, looking at Mendelian genetics and genetic variation and predicting the probability of next generations. So real quick reminder, there's no homework. That's not true. That's not true. Actually, there is homework. I'm going to cross that out with a big fat red pen. You have STEM scopes. I need you to go on STEM scopes. You have a reading. It's a really interesting read, I think. Wow, this is really hard to do with a mouse. So go onto your STEM scopes. Everybody has this assigned to them. It is due at the end of the week. So that is this Friday, May 1st. You will have a quiz on Friday on Edulastic. So keep that in mind. All right. Have a great Monday, everyone.